I'm going to do a critical reading presentation of The Pedestrian, just as though we were doing a class lecture. This is for both my online classes and for my seated class. For my seated class, this is what we would have done in class this week if we hadn't had these snow days. For my online class, my online classes, this is the kind of thing that I think can be helpful if you watch this video to sort of see how we would go through a story and talk it out. If we were in class, we would have all the input of the students, and we usually have really good discussions. But we have certain limitations when we're doing stuff online, and we're just going to try to um, expand our understanding of this story. All right. So The Pedestrian, written by Ray Bradbury, published in 1951, which is 75 years ago, roughly. That's a long time ago. And the interesting thing is that if we look at when the story is takes place, that's 2053. So about 100 years, he said it about 100 years in the future from when he wrote it. But we're actually closer in time to this story, the events of the story, than we are to the publication date when he wrote it, which is interesting when you think about it. So Ray Bradbury loves to write. He's known for his dystopian fiction. Fahrenheit 451 is the novel that most people will have read. It's kind of a typical book in high school that students read, so many of you may have read it already. All right, so we'll break down this story by looking at all of the literary elements, and we'll start with the main characters. When I start talking about a story, I usually say, okay, who are the main characters? What's going on in the story? Where is it set? In this case, we really only have one named main character. That's Mr. Mead, Leonard Mead, who is the pedestrian. Pedestrian, which is a walker, someone who's walking. Um, and that idea of walking, that theme of walking, runs through this whole story. The police car is a character, and then you could extend that to possibly the city itself. It takes place at night in the city. That takes us to our next literary element, which is the setting. In fact, it does take place at night in November, really specifically in November. Um, we get told that Leonard Mead goes out to walk in November. In fact, the opening couple of sentences, the whole first paragraph, sets the story in time and in place. And it reads, to enter out into that silence that was the city at 8 o'clock of a misty evening in November, to put your feet upon that buckling concrete walk, to step over grassy seams and make your way, hands in pocket, through the silences. That was what Mr. Leonard Mead most dearly loved to do. He would stand upon the corner of an intersection and peer down long moonlit avenues of sidewalk in four directions, deciding which way to go, but it really made no difference. He was alone in this world of AD 2053, or as good as alone, and with a final decision made, a path selected, he would stride off, sending patterns of frosty air before him like the smoke of a cigar. All right, so that first paragraph gives us a whole lot of information. We learn that Leonard Mead is going to be important. We learn that he's alone, that he likes to walk at night, that he likes to walk at night alone, and that he didn't have any purpose other than just to walk. All right. So before we move on, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about dystopian fiction and science fiction because this story does fall under those genres. Dystopian fiction, which is what this story, what the specific genre is, definitely dystopian fiction. It relates to fiction that describes a society that's frightening and dehumanizing, that it's oppressive, controlled, and totalitarian. We do see all of those elements in the pedestrian. Science fiction is a little bit broader. It's really an imagined world of futuristic science and technology. We do see that in this story, but in pure science fiction, that can be positive, not just a negative. And in this dystopian fiction, it's definitely a commentary on the negative effects of technology or a controlling regime. Um, some of the better known dystopian fiction. I mean, dystopian fiction is very popular right now. It has been for the past probably, well, probably since Ray Bradbury wrote it, but certainly in the past quarter century. Um, you probably recognize some of these as movies or books or that were made into movies or TV shows with The Matrix, Handmaid's Tale, Minority Report. Minority Report was first a novella by Philip K. Dick. Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, Hunger Games. Hunger Games is, you know, still young people still read. I read the Hunger Games when my kids were younger, and I wanted to know what was going on, and I enjoyed them. So, what kind of one of the purposes of dystopian and science fiction is it allows us to explore what's really going on in our world and the problems that are underlying these undercurrents in our own world. But by putting it in some futuristic place, we can examine them more objectively, if that makes sense. All right. Okay. So we talked about the character, the setting. Now let's talk about plot. You're going to be asked to give a small, very brief plot summary. The plot is generally what happens, just in a superficial way. This has got a simple plot. It's a short story. We could say that Leonard Mead goes out for a walk one evening in November by himself. He's stopped by a police car and is questioned. He's taken away by that police car, and we're told he's taken away to the psychiatric center for research on regressive tendencies. All right, we're going to talk about that. Let me go ahead and actually move forward. So, um, hold on, let me go back here. So, when we read a story for a class like this, we're going to kind of pay attention to the literary elements that come into play. And I know some students think, oh, this is going to ruin it for me. But it doesn't. It actually, like for me, when I think about these pieces that come into play, it makes it more rich. It enriches my understanding of the story rather than taking away. I usually read a story once just to have it flow over me. And then I start thinking, well, what's going on? How I have a feeling when I'm done. I notice things. So let me think about those things more specifically. So in the story, we're going to think about setting, which we've already talked about, symbolism. That's when something tangible stands for some idea or quality or some intangible, like the dove standing for peace kind of thing. We're going to talk about imagery, which is descriptive language. There's a lot of imagery. That paragraph I read you is just full of imagery of solitude, loneliness, nighttime. And of course, we can think about the nighttime as being symbolic of things, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Then tone and mood. This is the author's attitude, which is also sort of kind of comes into play with the setting. The setting, as well as the author's attitude, sets that tone and that mood. We will talk about motif. That's a recurring element. We definitely have a motif going on in the story. Irony, that's when there's a contrast between what you expect and what you say. Um, Conflict, struggle. Usually, when we talk about conflict in stories, we're talking about big conflicts. In this case, man against technology, maybe. Foreshadowing, that's little hints or clues about what happens next. Then allegory, and that's a story that's meant to teach some kind of lesson. And I think we see that in the story. All right. So let me show you how I would do what kind of notes and highlights I might take. So in a story like this, see if we can get this. So I read you this paragraph and we saw imagery going on. We talk about moonlit avenues, intersection. I have this passage here highlighted. So this idea of nighttime and solitude, um, that's something that I wanted to think about. So I highlighted it and said, that's interesting. Um, then down here in this paragraph, I highlighted some things like, and I underlined some things about graveyards and grave phantoms and whisperings and murmurings. So, you know, this is where Leonard Mead is out walking and we learn kind of his thoughts and what's going on because this is a third person limited point of view. We aren't in Leonard Mead's head exactly, but we are. So everything we notice is what he would notice. So as he's out walking, he's alone, and yet we learn down here in this area that it's a city of 3 million people. And he's been out walking 10 years, day or night, thousands of miles. He never met another person walking, not once in all that time. So there's this idea of walking is now being, you can start to notice it as being transgressive, something he shouldn't be doing. Um, that simple act of walking. So there's a motif of death and graveyard um, images going on. We have a little bit of foreshadowing going on here where he mentions the dogs in intermittent squads. That is going to foreshadow his interaction with the police car later. Um, we learn about his internal world and we learn that people um, don't go out at night. They stay inside and they watch TV all the time. Remember, this is 1951. So TV is seen as something that has the potential to brainwash people. And I think people talked about that in 1951. We see parallels today. Anytime there's new technology, people get worried. What's going to happen? So in this case, the TV is that new technology. So more about the loneliness of Leonard Mead, this idea that he's out walking alone at night, silent streets, long and empty, only his shadows moving. Again, we learn some more about the fact that he's been doing this a long time. And that he doesn't seem to have anybody. More of his ruminations on television. Um, and at this point, he has interaction with the police car. And it's a metallic voice, so not a human voice. That's important to note. He is directed not to move and then starts getting questioned. And we learn that there are 3 million people in this city, but there's only one police car. And so we say, that's weird. Is that a good thing? Crime is down, crime is ebbing. Um, no need for police now. So clearly there's some measure of control, crime control that's happened. And Bradbury doesn't come straight out and say it, but we definitely have to connect it to that television. Um, that's there and that connection should be made. All right. So um, the police car asks his name in a metallic whisper, and he couldn't see the men in it for the bright light. And this is foreshadowing of what we're going to learn later about that police car. So it's very menacing, very controlling. He gets asked his profession. He says, I guess you'd call me a writer. So no profession. So the police car makes the statement that there's no profession if you're a writer. Um, and now we get Leonard Mead thinking to himself, yeah, you're right. Maybe you might say that. He hadn't written in years. Magazines and books didn't sell anymore. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Everything went on in the tomb-like houses at night now, he thought, continuing his fancy. The tombs ill-lit by television light where people sat like the dead, the gray and multicolored lights touching their faces, but never really touching them. Okay, so let me, uh, okay. So again, back to that death image and that motif of graveyard. And here's this interaction about walking, where normal behavior, what should be normal for human beings, is considered and perceived as regressive or abnormal. Okay. We also learn in this questioning that he's not married, so not part of society. He does not have connections to human beings, and yet you might say he's the most connected character in a sense. He's the most human. He perceives all of the people in the city around him as being disconnected, and yet he's got nobody at home. So at the bottom, the police car says, "Get in." All right. Um, and Leonard protests. He protests twice. And then this is an interesting thing. At the top of this, right here, he walked like a man suddenly drunk after the police car, said Mr. Mead. As he passed the front window of the car, he looked in. As he had expected, there was no one in the front seat, no one in the car at all. This is a pretty loaded passage. First of all, he seems somehow overpowered, even though he's never touched by the police car. You get the feeling that he's somehow controlled because he walked like a man suddenly drunk. And he gets in, even though he's protested. Um, and it feels somehow disconnected. It smelled too clean and hard and metallic. There was nothing soft there, nothing human. He's being taken to the Psychiatric Center for Research on Regressive Tendencies. Regressive meaning returning to former, less developed ways. In this case, we've got this idea of his walking, his need to seem to want to have more than the television set. Um, and in the end, they pass his house. No one answered him. The car moved down the empty riverbed streets and off away, leaving the empty streets with the empty sidewalks. All this repetition of empty 3 times, and no sound and no motion all the rest of the chill November night. All right. So, as we go and, oh, let me get my back to normal size. Okay. So the final element that we look for in a story or a poem, but now we're talking about stories, is the theme. So that's the central or underlying meaning of a story. And I know students have been asked, all through high school, probably even middle school, what's the theme? And it feels scary sometimes. I think to have to boil down, like, I don't know, I can't see, I don't have that, you know, like I'm too stupid to come up with a theme. I can't imagine. I just don't see it. But the theme is simply just what gives story meaning. It's this idea, its impact, its staying power. It's some truth that's more universal. So in this case, we could talk about the theme as possibly being the dangers of technology replacing human connection, or the loss of individuality, um, or loss of creativity by the overwhelming conformity of technology, possibly. So, and there are usually multiple ways of looking at a story in terms of theme. All right, so in this story, again, we say, so we definitely got a sense of the setting. How does that setting contribute to this story? How is it going to contribute to that overall theme? Well, it's this sense of being alone, being at night. It's November, it's chilly, it's misty. Um, no one's there, no one's ever been there. So that sets a tone and a mood. So the setting works on the tone and the mood to give us an ominous, dark mood. It's occasional bits of humor. Leonard Mead has funny thoughts in his head. But it's dark humor. So there's definitely this sense of the ominous. And that's true when we talk about symbolism. So we've got the television as being symbolic. We've got walking as being symbolic. We've got the police car, graveyard. So lots of symbolic things in this story. And we say, well, what does it stand for? Well, the graveyard, that stands for this death of the human interaction in front of in the face of television and technology. Police car definitely symbolizes control. Walking could symbolize our connection with the earth. We've got a lot of imagery. That first paragraph, we talked about all of the images of the nighttime, the city at night, but also dark images with the dogs, the squads of dogs. Then we've got this graveyard motif that runs through, tombstone motif that runs through the whole story, um, showing that, yes, the buildings are there, but what's inside is no longer alive. And then conflict. So the actual conflict is Leonard Mead with the police car, but if we take that out broader, it's humans' conflict with authority or with technology, however you want to look at it. We get that foreshadowing going on with the dogs, and then the foreshadowing with the police car with the metallic voice that foreshadows that idea that there's not going to be any human being inside. We even maybe get that foreshadowing that talk about walking quite a lot in terms of what's going to happen. Um, he's definitely going to be singled out for walking. So the story is an allegory. Its purpose is to highlight that dehumanizing of technology on society. And again, that brings us to what's the theme of the story? Well, we could look at loss of individuality, the theme of the loss of creativity, or the dangers of technology. So when we've gone through our story in this way, the next bit is we need to answer those 8 questions that for our reading response paper. And the next video is going to go over reading response more specifically. I'll pull up that reading response, those questions and those instructions, but I have them written here, and we'll talk about those questions in terms of this story. So you're going to answer what the plot is. 2 sentences is all you need for this. This is very, very straightforward. Most important character, you've got to decide, is it Leonard Mead? Is it the police car? What do you think? Setting. Why is the setting important to this story? Then fourth, What's the most important word in this reading? So you might pick, like if it were me, I might pick the pedestrian. It's in the title. It seems to be why Leonard Mead was singled out. He was out walking. That was bad. The police car stopped him and said, "Hey, buddy, get in the car. You're out walking alone at night. Can't do that." Um, so you're going to pick your most important word in the story. Then you're going to figure out what's the most important line in the reading. Which passage or line impacted you the most and why? Then what word is not in the reading that explains the reading? So is it control? Is it oppressive? Is it what is it? So you're going to pick something that really encapsulates the feeling of this story, but it's not something Ray Bradbury actively says. Then what's the deeper meaning? So we know the plot, but what's really going on? And then finally talk about the theme. Once you've gotten all those questions answered, you're going to write it up in a little paper. You watch my next video and I'll talk about that.